Senate Committee on Banking, Housing, and Urban Affairs will come to order. This hearing is in a hybrid format. Our members will be here both in person. Senator Rounds and the ranking member and I are here now. Others will be joining online. The witnesses are all appearing virtually. I think we had to because of Senator Dole's the celebration of his life last week. We had to change the hearing date, so some that were going to join us in person couldn't. So for those who've not done this, the witnesses, once you start speaking, there'll be a slight delay before you're displayed on the screen. To minimize background noise, please click the mute button until it's your turn to speak or ask questions. You should have a box on your screen labeled clock that will show how much time is remaining. At 30 seconds, you'll hear a beep then when your time's up. So stick to the 5 minutes, please, if you can. Any technology issue, Cameron and all of us will move to the next witness until he can resolve it. As we're here in a hybrid format or speaking order, as always, will be by seniority of the members who checked in at the gavel, either in person or online. So then we go back and forth by party. This morning, the Banking, Housing, and Urban Affairs Committee looks at the authorization of the Community Development Block Grant Disaster Recovery Program, known as, sorry for the acronym, CDBG-DR. We meet today in the wake of devastating tornadoes that have taken lives of more than 80 people, torn apart families, destroyed homes and businesses and infrastructure across multiple states, including Kentucky, Illinois, and our new colleague, Senator Hagerty's state of Tennessee. We've heard heartbreaking and infuriating stories, lives torn apart, workers put in danger unnecessarily, apparently. I want to express my sincere condolences to the families and communities affected by these storms. Even before this weekend's tragic events, we'd already seen 18 natural disasters, 538 people lost their lives in calendar year 2021. Losses exceeded $1 billion. From drought to flooding to severe storm, from wildfires to tropical cyclones to winter storms, these events touched all kinds of communities across the country. Homes and businesses destroyed, local economies devastated. None of our states are immune. The people of Dayton and Trotwood are still working to recover from tornadoes that destroyed their neighborhoods in 2019. Senators Menendez and Kennedy's states, though more than 1,000 miles apart, were both devastated by Hurricane Ida this summer. With a changing climate and, frankly, Congress's failure to do much about addressing that climate change, our country will continue to face extreme weather events and natural disasters. We must be better prepared to recover from these disasters quickly, efficiently, and equitably. We must rebuild to make our homes and communities more resilient in the future. Today's hearing will look at the critical role CDBG-DR plays in offering disaster relief and long-term recovery assistance to communities affected by disasters. We'll discuss how we can improve that aid, I hope through a permanent authorization of the program. Since 1993, Congress has provided $95 billion with a B, $95,000 million in disaster relief recovery assistance to states and territories and communities through supplemental CDBG disaster recovery appropriations. The aid's particularly critical to low-income and middle-class families, usually hit the hardest by natural disasters and always have the fewest resources to fight back. While Congress has relied on CDBG-DR to provide flexible long-term recovery assistance to communities in need, we have never provided a permanent authorization for this program. CDBG-DR is a valuable tool in the federal disaster response toolkit to help communities across the country pick up the pieces and rebuild following disasters. The program has helped families and communities address needs that have been unmet by insurance and federal assistance from FEMA and the SBA. But as valuable as this aid has been, we've also heard from survivors and from state and local governments, GAO, HUD, and others that we can and should do better. In the absence of a permanent long-term or permanent authorization, HUD must issue new regulations with each appropriation. We've heard that the delays and lack of predictability stemming from the process, delays in getting assistance out to families, communities prevented from doing the kind of early planning that will be most effective, confusion created for states and localities and families over what resources are available. Think about what these families deal with. Your home has been flooded. The business your family built for 2 generations was destroyed. You're trying to deal with insurance claims. Bills are piling up. Debt collectors are calling, just getting day to day through your personal life. The last thing you want to do is deal with more delays, more red tape, more confusion. That's where we come in to fix that. Variations in appropriations and regulatory requirements between disasters can impose administrative and operational challenges for HUD and grantees, particularly smaller communities or those administering multiple grants, and hinder efforts to build capacity. We must do more to ensure that the most vulnerable members of our community are not displaced and they can help their community recover. In response to recommendations from GAO, HUD, and others, Republican Senators Collins and Young, Democratic Senators Schatz, Van Hollen, and Tester have offered S2471 to authorize and improve this program. It's something that should be an opportunity for bipartisan common sense solutions, how we make government more efficient, actually do the job it's supposed to do for the people whom we serve. We'll hear from our witnesses about authorizing CDBG, DR, how authorizing the program could help our communities recover and deliver resources in a more timely, effective, and equitable manner. And without objection, Senator Toomey, I'd like to enter into the record a letter from the Disaster Housing Recovery Coalition in support of 2471. Without objection, so ordered. Senator Toomey.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I, too, want to start off by acknowledging the horrific destruction that we witnessed over the weekend in Kentucky. I saw a headline this morning that 12 children were among the 74 killed by that storm. Of course, the death toll is expected to only rise in the coming days. It's just unbelievably tragic news. My heart goes out to the families who are experiencing this devastating loss of their lives, their families. All of our thoughts are with them. I would suggest that today's hearing is about HUD's Community Development Block Grant Disaster Recovery Program, or the CDBG-DR. This is about something different. Since 1993, Congress has spent nearly $90 billion through CDBG-DR to support disaster recovery efforts. Initially, CDBG-DR was used in rare cases when the billions of dollars that Congress spent annually on disaster recovery through other programs was considered insufficient to meet the needs of serious disasters. Unfortunately, since Superstorm Sandy in 2012, CDBG-DR spending has become routine. In the past 4 years alone, we've appropriated almost $40 billion for CDBG-DR. And we've done this though billions of dollars of CDBG-DR funds appropriated for prior disasters, including the 9/11 attacks and disasters that occurred more than a decade ago, remain with grantees and remain unspent. So I worry that making CDBG-DR a permanent program without a more comprehensive review of disaster assistance will only ensure that this wasteful trend continues. In my view, we ought to be discussing whether such spending through HUD is appropriate in the first place, not making it permanent, because we already have an agency whose sole mission is, and I quote, to help people before, during, and after disasters, end quote. That agency is called FEMA. Through the normal appropriations process, Congress provides billions every year to FEMA and other agencies so that the federal government can provide assistance to support communities struck by disasters. In addition to those regular channels, Congress makes emergency supplemental disaster appropriations almost every single year. Let's consider some key examples of existing programs. The Army Corps of Engineers and FEMA deploy boots on the ground to help survivors and repair damage to communities. FEMA funds repairs and replacement of homes for displaced families. Small Business Administration does as well, including replacement of personal property. Given all of this support, why do we also need CDBG-DR? Now, theoretically, CDBG-DR is supposed to support longer-term recovery needs that aren't met by other sources. And I acknowledge there may be some circumstances where it's useful for the federal government to help meet those needs. But we need to remember that states and local governments are primarily responsible for addressing these needs. Currently, states and local governments are not lacking for financial resources at all. In 2020, state and local tax collections set an all-time record. On top of their record tax collections, Congress sent another $900 billion to state and local governments for COVID relief over the course of the year. This included $5 billion specifically for CDBG, a significant portion of which remains unspent and is available for purposes such as disaster relief. And then in November, Congress just passed a $1.2 trillion infrastructure bill that will send billions more dollars to state and local governments, while states are sitting on record budget surpluses and have more money on the way now, thanks to this recently passed bill. Why shouldn't they plan and save some of that money for long-term disaster recovery and mitigation? We also shouldn't ignore the fact that CDBG-DR has long been plagued by waste, fraud, and abuse through the years. Let's consider some examples of that waste. 2 years after Hurricane Katrina hit, HUD allowed Louisiana to use CDBG-DR funds to pay college professors stipends to stay in the state post-Katrina because that was an urgent need activity. In Mississippi, HUD allowed a county to use 9.6 million CDBG-DR funds to build a wastewater treatment facility for an undeveloped plot of land where nobody lived. As bad as these cases of waste are, the examples of fraud in the CDBG-DR may be even worse. HUD's Inspector General has repeatedly identified and referred for prosecution cases of fraud and abuse in CDBG-DR, including public corruption, embezzlement, bid rigging, bribery, and kickback schemes. So given this track record, it makes one wonder, how well does HUD respond to fraud risks in the CDBG-DR program? Well, we know the answer to that. This year, HUD officials admitted to GAO that HUD, and I quote, does not consider fraud risks in programs managed by grantees to be direct risks to HUD itself, end quote. In other words, HUD's responsibility to root out fraud ends when it sends CDBG-DR money to states. Well, that's concerning since Congress recently appropriated nearly $20 billion through CDBG-DR to Puerto Rico that the Biden administration has been eager to quickly distribute to a government with rampant fiscal mismanagement, to say the least. Today we'll hear from Matt Mayer, a former DHS official and an expert on disaster recovery who has concerns with proposals to permanently authorize the CDBG-DR program. As Mr. Mayer notes, the over-federalization of disaster assistance for virtually every disaster has allowed states to just reduce their own emergency management programs, knowing that federal taxpayers will be forced to bail them out. He also sensibly notes that Congress should step back and consider whether it should continue to federalize virtually all long-term disaster recovery well after the crisis has passed, since that has traditionally been a state and local function. I look forward to hearing from today's witnesses about the CDBG-DR program. I recognize that improvements are needed in how the federal government provides disaster assistance. But for the reasons I've mentioned, I'm concerned that creating a permanent authorization for the CDBG-DR program is not the right way to go. As President Reagan wisely noted, government programs are the nearest thing to eternal life we'll ever see on this earth, so we should tread carefully before we create a new one.
Thank you, Senator Toomey. I'll introduce the three witnesses, all remote, all calling from, I assume, their homes or offices. Mr. Michael Sprayberry joins us from North Carolina. He's a senior advisor for emergency management at Haggerty Consulting. Previously served in emergency management roles in the state of North Carolina for 42 years. He led the state emergency response team's recovery efforts through state and federally declared disasters. He served as president of the National Emergency Management Association from 2017 to 18. Mr. Sprayberry, welcome. Mr. Matt Mayer is the president of Opportunity Ohio in my state and is joining us remotely from our home state. Prior to his current position, Mr. Mayer has written on national security issues as a visiting fellow with the American Enterprise Institute and a visiting scholar for the Heritage Foundation. Mr. Mayer also serves as a senior official at the U.S. served, past tense, as a senior official at the U.S. Department of Homeland Security under Secretaries Ridge and Chertoff. Mr. Mayer, welcome. Dr. Carlos Martin is joining us remotely also. He's a fellow at the Brookings Institute and director of the Remodeling Futures program at Harvard's Joint Center for Housing Studies. Dr. Martin previously led the Urban Institute's Built Environment practice area, leading all research on energy efficiency, climate adaptation, environmental governance, the housing industry, and construction regulations. Thanks to all three of you for joining us. Again, apologies for moving the hearing from last week to this morning. Each of you will speak for 5 minutes, and then we will take questions. We'll start with you, Mr. Sprayberry.
Good morning, Chairman Brown, Ranking Member Toomey, and members of the committee. My name is Mike Sprayberry, and I am the Senior Advisor for Emergency Management with Haggerty Consulting Incorporated, a firm which specializes in emergency management and disaster recovery. I appreciate the opportunity to appear today to discuss and support permanent authorization for the Community Development Block Grant Disaster Recovery Program administered by the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development. Prior to joining Haggerty 2 months ago, I served the state of North Carolina for 15 years in leadership roles with the state's Division of Emergency Management, including 8 years as director, while also leading the state's Office of Recovery and Resiliency and serving as the state's Deputy Homeland Security Advisor. I also served as president of the National Emergency Management Association in 2017 and 18. In this context, I gained familiarity with both the value of the CDBG-DR program as well as the difficulties in deploying that funding. Since 2017, North Carolina received more than $778 million in the CDBG-DR funding, plus $202 million in CDBG mitigation funding in response to Hurricanes Matthew and Florence. That funding has enabled a stronger focus on housing recovery needs and has assisted low and moderate income populations that have the fewest resources to recover. At the same time, the lack of a permanent authorization for CDBG-DR has hampered its effectiveness. The most critical issue is the ad hoc nature of CDBG-DR due to the lack of a formal statutory and regulatory structure. This fact contributes to unnecessary delays across the board. Delays in federal appropriation, delays in HUD's allocation process, delays in developing federal register notices that govern the use of the funds, and ultimately delays in delivering assistance to disaster survivors and impacted jurisdictions. My written statement cites how, after Florence made landfall in September 2018, it took 500 days for HUD to publish a Federal Register notice governing available CDBG-DR assistance. While the process will never be instantaneous, timelines can significantly be reduced with permanent authorization. Let me also make the important case for small CDBG-DR planning allocations shortly after a major disaster is declared. This step would provide a clear message to jurisdictions that further assistance is likely and that implementation efforts should be launched to prepare for that possibility. Again, actions of this nature should be viewed as helping to reduce the overall time that will take households and communities to recover from disaster events. I'm aware that there are concerns as to whether CDBG-DR should be authorized on a permanent basis. As we evaluate those concerns, we can see the reality of 32 appropriations totaling $95 billion over the past 3 decades. These facts seem instructive that CDBG-DR is likely to be funded in the future, and it would be valuable in delivering aid to disaster survivors if that funding were deployed more effectively. Permanent authorization of CDBG-DR is a large step in that direction, and for that reason, I would support enactment of Senate 2471, the Reforming Disaster Recovery Act. Thank you for this opportunity, and I look forward to addressing your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Sprayberry. Mr. Mayor is with us from Ohio. Mr. Mayor, welcome.
Thank you, Chairman Brown, Ranking Member Toomey, and committee senators. Thank you for the opportunity to appear before the committee to testify on the issues before us today. My name is Matt Mayer. I'm president of Opportunity Ohio. In lieu of reading my written statement and taking all of my 5-minute allocation, I'll briefly summarize my concerns with the legislation and leave more time to answer any questions you might have for me. My largest concern with the proposed legislation is that it continues the federalization of natural disasters that started in 1993 and has accelerated each decade, as more natural disasters that used to be considered inherently state and local disasters have received federal declarations and therefore federal funding. Secondarily, it creates a permanent program, including permanent staff and regulatory control outside of the Federal Emergency Management Agency to deal with elements following a natural disaster, which I believe causes delays, gaps, inefficiencies, and waste. Another concern is that my research has shown that federal funds tend to supplant rather than supplement state and local funds, which is what occurred with Homeland Security grants following 9/11. Finally, the well-established patterns of where natural disasters occur results in the vast majority of states subsidizing the states where the bulk of FEMA HUD funding flows, which is inequitable to taxpayers in, quote, safer states. Thank you for the opportunity to testify to this committee. Please let me know if there's anything I can do as you debate the proposed legislation. Thank you.
I think it's good to see somebody from Ohio come in way under the time limit. So no, we're usually not that aren't that good. So it doesn't happen every time. Dr. Martine, welcome. Thank you for joining us.
Good morning, and thank you, Chairman Brown and Ranking Member Toomey and members of the committee for this opportunity to present my findings from my research. The views I expressed today are my own and shouldn't be attributed to any of the institutions, the research organizations with which I have collaborated. So my work explores many aspects of CDBGDR, and there are several findings that I can share today. Among the most critical is simply that CDBGDR works. It fills needs that remain after disaster and after other assistance is exhausted. These are needs that persist particularly for residents that cannot recover on their own. My work shows that disasters have a long-term negative financial impact on the housing and the household finances of survivors for years after the event. Without assistance, that impact is longer and deeper. The depth of impact holds true across jurisdictions, regardless of their size or populations, or the severity of disaster damages, or of the political composition of their state and local leaders. CDBGDR has made a qualitative and quantitative difference in many survivors' lives. That does not mean there is not room for improvement. But CPD has been forthcoming with regards to the improvements identified by its own staff and from past and current grantees, and they have acted on them. One study I conducted for HUD's Policy Development and Research Office noted an increased speed in HUD's process over a decade of disasters, beginning with Hurricane Katrina in 2005. I believe that HUD has squeezed out many improvements in the process under its staff purview, that is, after congressional appropriations. Yet, as you know, these are special appropriations, and they often lead to change in program rules that lead to delays and uncertainty for the survivor communities and complexity for the local officials. Remaining opportunities exist for consistency, for efficiency and speed, for comprehensively serving the most severely affected communities and households, and for monitoring compliance with all federal statutes. On the first count, CDBGDR's lack of permanent statutory authority has impeded consistency. Codifying the program could yield consistent rules, standardized and more sophisticated reporting and record keeping, and more uniform technical assistance offerings. There are also benefits for HUD and its grantees in their planning and timing from the consistency established through permanent authorization. Next, speed is impeded by the uncertainty and delayed access to funds. In my study, the length of time between the disaster and HUD's allocation, that is, the federal activity before state and local grantees are directly involved, shapes the time after in which grantees design, launch, and ramp up their programs. I've encountered numerous cases of jurisdictions being unable to plan, act, and inform households of their options because of the lack of knowing whether and when funds would come. This omission leads to suboptimal recovery for everyone. Efficient and early resources and knowledge make a difference in lives and livelihoods. HUD's general CDBG program has a requirement to serve low to moderate income households that could be pursued even more deeply with permanently authorized CDBG-DR. Our research shows that survivor households continue to slip through the cracks because they lack the resources to wait or to absorb delay or change. Extremely low income households and low to moderate income renters are particularly vulnerable. These groups suffer from even modest financial hits and personal damages. They could benefit from other changes I've already mentioned simply because clearer rules and faster funding can help jurisdictions catch them before they slip through the cracks. But with these changes, there is an increased responsibility to make it easier for the most vulnerable households to apply, qualify, and access assistance. So lastly, HUD and its grantees could aggressively expand the robust, consistent, and transparent data about the household beneficiaries once given the breathing space of permanent authorization and early fund dispersals. Ensuring that data gaps are filled will help HUD and the federal government confirm that grantees will both use funds effectively and in ways that target households with the most severe and ongoing vulnerabilities. CDBGDR serves as a bridge between immediate crisis and long-term community development. Yet that bridge has been temporary and ephemeral without the stability of statutory program authorization or the security of resources to let households and communities decide their path to becoming whole. Future disasters are certain. We must respond with equal certainty and purposeful clarity. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Dr. Martine. I will start with Mr. Sprayberry. Thank you for comments. I especially appreciated, and I mentioned it to the ranking member, what you said about the ad hoc situation and the problems that causes. From your experience in North Carolina, how would authorization of CDBG DR, for which you advocate, how would it help deliver efficient, effective disaster assistance to survivors contrasted with what we do now?
Yes, sir, and thank you for that question. So, it will allow states to effectively plan to receive the funds, and that's critical. If if it's codified and we know that it's coming, the team can begin planning. We know that's going to reduce delays in the implementation. As I mentioned, during Hurricane Florence, we waited for 500 days before we got our Federal Register notice. And so that was, when you have people standing by, I mean, to get that type of information, it slows everything up. So I think that that would help us out. I think also we want to talk about establishing a front end fund for CDBG DR, a mechanism so that we can begin to procure staffing and have contracts in place so that when the funding is actually allocated from HUD and hits the state, we're well prepared to basically pivot and start getting that money to the people that need it most.
I'm sorry to interrupt. Did that 500 days did that surprise you, or we see that everywhere, more or less?
It did surprise me, sir. And so I can tell you that in Hurricane Matthew, we were hit in October, I think the 8th and 9th of October. Congress appropriated the funding in December, and we got the Federal Register in January. And so that was just a couple of months, and we were not prepared for Florence, which was our storm of record in North Carolina. Go ahead.
Okay, well, and it's so clear to me, listening to you, Mr. Sprayberry, and listening to the other two witnesses, that communities could use help in thinking through long-term housing and community recovery needs, and we do that better when we have a federal law sort of directing, I would hope could write it bipartisanly as we direct this agency and others on what to do. Let me shift to Dr. Martine. Based on your research, Dr. Martine, what policy changes through authorization could ensure that HUD disaster recovery dollars are distributed more equitably, more quickly, especially among communities that are almost always hit the hardest by these natural disasters?
Certainly. And we're talking about different pieces of what a permanent authorization allows, right? One is the actual knowing that there's going to be resources coming down, then the actual amount of the resources, and then the program rules. And all of these expedited and clear with clear expectations on the state and local grantees will be able to make programs much more robust, much more clearly addressing the most vulnerable communities in their regions that are affected. And that is particularly true of the most vulnerable, the extremely low-income folks that you're asking me about. I think in particular, those folks are the least likely to be able to survive waiting for a longer period. They're the ones who slip through the cracks. And so the earlier and more consistent amount of funding, the easier it is for state and local grantees to target and do outreach for those communities to ensure that they are applying and that they are eligible for the assistance that they are due.
Thank you. Let me pursue that. As you know, this Senate for the last 10 months is known in part for actually addressing issues of poverty, the child tax credit. 90% of families in my state with children under 18 are getting at least a $3,000 tax cut, and that's life-changing for so many. We know pre-pandemic, you mentioned a moment of renters. It's pre-pandemic, 25% of renters in this country paid more than half their income in rent. One thing goes wrong, forgetting a natural disaster, put that aside, but one thing goes wrong and their life turns upside down, their car breaks down, their child gets sick, they miss 3 days of work from a minor workplace injury. What barriers do renters specifically face in accessing housing recovery funding? Answer that, and I'm sorry, in the last few seconds, answer that, please, and then what we should do about it in reauthorization.
Sure. So there are two of the strongest vulnerabilities. Or one is that as renters tend to be lower income than homeowners. They have obviously less built-in wealth to be able to recover and establish. And so they can't access funds like the Small Business Administration loan program because they don't have a home to hold the loan against. And so financially, they're the hardest hit. That's the most important. Second, though, is that oftentimes in these communities, the rental housing is lost. The rental housing is damaged, just as single-family housing is damaged. But it takes much longer to rebuild affordable rental housing in these communities. In my written testimony, I give a graph showing the different ranges of activities that CDBGDR provides, and the construction of new affordable rental housing is the second longest of all the activities. So the earlier that starts, the likelier it'll be that you keep these people within the community and give them housing as quickly as possible. And making sure that that rental housing is built as quickly as possible is absolutely critical.
Thank you, Senator Toomey.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So theoretically, CDBG-DR is only available when it becomes clear that all the other resources the federal government provides for a particular emergency are insufficient. The federal support for a declared emergency seems fairly comprehensive. I mean, FEMA immediately arrives along with the Army Corps to clear debris and other damage. Volunteer organizations and charities also support those efforts. FEMA and SBA also support repair and replacement of homes damaged as a result of disasters. SBA also supports recoveries for businesses and even funds replacement of personal property. Then, of course, these programs are designed to supplement insurance policies, which families and small businesses should carry to protect against catastrophic events. And the IRS allows deductions for casualty losses resulting from disasters. So this is a pretty big network of support. And Mr. Mayor, you've suggested that, well, we know there are some state and local contributions. Sometimes they go in the form of a percentage of matching grant. But, Mr. Mayor, you suggested that the CDBG-DR probably tends to supplant rather than supplement state and local money. And so I wonder if you could give us some of your thoughts on why does that matter? Are there issues of moral hazard that arise? Are there issues about whether a state and local government is better equipped to make judgments about longer-term investments? What about accountability of how this money is spent? Could you elaborate at all on why you think it's a bad idea to supplant state and local money with federal money?
Yeah, sure. Ranking Member Toomey, thank you for the question. So what we learned after 9/11 with the Homeland Security grant funding, and then we also learned this with the federalization through FEMA of natural disasters, is more and more disasters that historically were not federalized, that remain state and local issues to deal with entirely. As we federalize more of those in both the Homeland Security grant world as well as the FEMA world, what the research showed is that when states and localities began to have that predictability that there will be federal funds, they started to defund those kind of programs and move the money elsewhere so that they could spend it differently. And so the concern that I guess I have is, when you step back, nobody probably disagrees that substantively getting help to people is critical, and we should do that as often as much as we can. That goes without question. I guess the key is, where does that help come from? And given the fact that state coffers are high right now, all the funds that have come in through the pandemic and through the infrastructure legislation that you guys passed, there's a lot of money out there. And so, when we get into this issue of creating new permanent federal programs, states and localities, like any other creatures, will act in their own self-interest, and they'll see that as a way that they can then shift funds elsewhere, do other things, because they can kind of have that handout to the federal government to have those funds come in. So again, my broad concern on the supplementation issue is, history has shown us with both the Homeland Security grants and FEMA, as it federalized more and more inherently as state and local disasters historically, that emergency management funds went down, and then preparedness, terrorism, all that activity then got shifted down because they could just wait for the annual influx of funding from the feds. And then I think that's that's not where we want to go, because it inherently means you're always looking toward Washington for the solution rather than building the capacity there in the state and local communities where things occur. And again, you have the occasional Kentucky tornado event happen. We all know that, but typically there is some regularity to natural disasters. We know where they occur, which ones will occur, and historically we tend to know what's going to happen. So creating that predictability is important for state and locals to do, and not rely upon the federal government to sweep in and kind of come to the rescue. We need to build that at the state and local level and save federal funds for kind of some of the most important stuff, especially as we pass $30 trillion in debt.
Yeah, and just to follow up on this issue of the concentration, because I don't think anybody disputes the idea when a disaster strikes, you want to immediately flood the zone with resources to ameliorate the situation as much as you can. But in terms of long-term projects and construction and even future mitigation, as you point out, these kinds of events don't occur uniformly across the country. There are certain regions that are more prone than others. It also happens that the nature of the damage is mostly on property, and it tends to be very valuable property. So Florida is particularly at risk, and Florida, of course, has some of the most valuable property in America. But both coasts tend to have a higher concentration of these risks. So federalizing this long-term mitigation seems to be a subsidy from the interior of the country to the coasts, and I'm sure there are exceptions to that. But is that a fair generalization in your mind, Mr. Mayor?
It's not only a fair generalization, it's a fact. I went through and did the research where it looked at where all the funding had gone over the course of time, and in where there was the occurrence of natural disasters. And what you saw is exactly that states like Ohio, Pennsylvania, Indiana, Michigan, the interior part of the country, the Great Plains, New England, the Midwest, the Mountain West, tended not to have that many declared disasters in any given period of time compared to your kind of southern East Coast, the Gulf Coast in the California area. And as a result, what ended up happening is taxpayers in those other states that are, quote, safer, their funding that goes to these programs gets essentially shifted down to taxpayers in those other places. So we're seeing a subsidization occur, which to me is just somewhat inequitable when you think about, again, many of these things are typically stuff historically that were inherently state and locally handled, but we have federalized them over the last 30 years. And if we could step back from that, I think we might see a bit better resiliency and performance at state and local level than we have tended to see as we ramp these things up to the federal government.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Senator Reed from Rhode Island is recognized for 5 minutes remote.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, gentlemen, for your testimony. Mr. Martin, in your testimony, you noted that the capacity and experience of the state and local government and the amount of early resources makes a significant difference. And I think, Mr. Sprayberry, your experience in North Carolina would reinforce that. How can we help HUD work with local communities to build up technical capacity for these disasters? And I would think, authorizing this legislation would give HUD an incentive and need legal authority to do so. But Mr. Martin, your comments first.
Correct. So there are two benefits of permanent authorization for that specific issue about state and local capacity. And one is having clarity of rules and eligible activities. Everything becomes less of a appropriation-based directive and understanding the just predictability of what the program is going to be expecting. So that's number one. The second is actual technical assistance offerings can then be standardized, and the jurisdictions can be trained on how to prepare, how to roll out their programs more quickly. I mean, the biggest challenge, particularly for housing recovery, has been in these are block grants, and so let's be clear about the issue of federalization is that the state and local governments get to decide how to use the money within statutory requirements. So there's always been a goal of being able to sort of roll out packages as quickly as possible so that you don't have that time gap between the early assistance that occurs and the later CPDR funding. So having clear clarity around what those programs are going to be, allows technical assistance providers to be that much more clear and specific and help those programs launch more quickly.
Your comments, Mr. Fairbury, please.
Yes, sir. And I agree with Dr. Martin that, the predictability is going to allow HUD to build those technical assistance teams that we rely on so heavily and have relied on here in North Carolina. As part of this bill, it will create an Office of Disaster Management and Resiliency within HUD, which I think is just going to even increase more standardization of how they deploy the program. So I think that this legislation is actually going to enhance the efficiency. And I know I heard earlier about maybe some issues in the past. I can tell you that in North Carolina, we are constantly audited, not just by HUD, but also by the state auditor, and to make sure that we're staying within the rails and that we're looking at all of the eligibility criteria to make sure that everything is dress right dress. So I believe that this type of legislation is only going to enhance that and making sure that everybody is staying, within the criteria, the eligibility criteria, and getting the funding out to those disaster survivors who need it so badly.
Thank you. One of the issues, one of the existential issues that we face is climate change. And in the old days, you could simply go back and build what you had and, pat yourself on the back. Now we have to prepare for a future in which climate risk is going up. We have to respond differently. And a similar question, how can this proposal help us ensure that local communities are not just building the same thing, but building for the future? Mr. Sperber?
Well, this legislation requires that the funding that is spent by the local jurisdictions is spent so that it meets those requirements and that you are, in fact, building back in a resilient way. That's a requirement. It also allows for up to 30% funding plus up for activities that reduce repetitive loss. And HUD's already started to move in this direction by providing CDBG mitigation. And so I think that you can see where, this legislation incorporates all of that together.
Well, thank you very much. Mr. Martin, a quick comment. I think I can't see the clock, so I'm imposing, I'm sure.
Continue, Senator Reed.
Mr. Martin, your comments.
That's completely correct. Because HUD has a specific role in the recovery framework to be a bridge to long-term community planning and long-term community development, there is an awareness of where the high exposed areas are, who the most vulnerable communities are, and that's the only way you're going to be able to plan for long-term adaptation.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Reed. Senator Menendez from New Jersey is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It's been 9 years since Hurricane Sandy devastated New Jersey, New York, and the Northeast. And despite some members' efforts to block disaster relief for our region, we succeeded in securing billions of dollars of CDBG-DR funding. 9 years later, HUD is attempting to claw back from New Jerseyans the money they used to repair their homes and get back on their feet. And the reason some New Jerseyans are facing these clawbacks is because CDBG grant money is considered to have duplicated a benefit with SBA loan money. Of course, loan money you have to pay back, grant money you don't. So, Mr. Sprayberry, can you explain why it was important that the Disaster Recovery Reform Act of 2018 ended the policy of SBA loans duplicating CDBG-DR?
Well, CDBG-DR is targeted for low to moderate income population. And so if they qualify for CDBG-DR, it's unclear to me why you would want to claw back the funding from an SBA loan. I know that that clawback is not consistent with, I think it's section 1210 of the Disaster Recovery Form Act of 2018, which caused HUD to revise their DOD policies and allowed them from the 1st of 2016 to the end of this month. You don't have to pay back your SBA loans, the ones that you declined or only received a part of. But I understand that doesn't cover you, sir,
Yeah.
in New Jersey.
Well, I just wanted the principle. I mean, an SBA loan you have to pay back, and that's fine. A CDBG DR, you get a grant, and so first of all, with I think horrible messaging to the potential victims in terms of what they could and could not do. So I appreciated that Congress prevented this issue for survivors from 2016 on. I hope my colleagues will work together with me to pass relief that the House of Representatives passed earlier this year in its appropriation bill so that these Sandy victims can close this dark chapter of their lives. I hear from some colleagues that CDBG-DR spending should be curbed, that the recovery process should be left to the states. You would be hard-pressed to find a place in the country that is not impacted by these natural disasters, whether it be flooding in my state, wildfires in the West, chronic droughts across the heartland. Every single state inevitably needs assistance. And it would be incredibly difficult for a state to meet those challenges. Look at what's happening now in Kentucky and other states. We know that for every dollar invested in mitigation, the federal government saves $6 in disaster relief spending. Mr. Martin, shouldn't Congress direct some CDBG-DR funds towards mitigation of risk so that we can protect our communities, reduce the fiscal damage to our local economies, and ultimately prevent more federal spending in the future?
That mitigation activities, I would agree with, should certainly be allowed. And the reality is that so many of the activities that occur in the long-term recovery, particularly for housing and community infrastructure, are also mitigation-related activities because they come in much longer in the sequence of events. Designating specific quantities of recovery versus mitigation per jurisdiction is going to be a little complicated because it's the nature of the hazard occurrence and the hazard frequency and hazard type that will vary in each place on the kind of mitigation activity. So the cost differentials between the two will be a little more complicated. But I would certainly think that mitigation activities should be encouraged in many of these jurisdictions as they rebuild in the long term.
Thank you. Finally, according to a HUD Inspector General report, the Trump administration intentionally stalled roughly $20 billion of CDBG-DR funds for Puerto Rico's recovery from Hurricane Maria, a storm that killed more than 3,000 people and more by some estimates. To make matters worse, the previous administration tried to obstruct the IG's investigation into the unprecedented stonewalling of congressionally appropriated disaster aid to Puerto Rico. I'm pleased to see that President Biden has freed the funding to the island, but the many harms of a delayed recovery linger. The island still faces a beleaguered power grid. Some families still have FEMA blue tops over their homes, which were supposed to be only temporary. Mr. Martin, shouldn't the CDBG-DR grant-making and rule-making process be standardized so that future administrations cannot arbitrarily block disaster aid for political or other reasons?
Certainly, and the holding back of money was after the allocation had already been made. And our study had shown that in the previous 10 years prior to that ended in 2015, 2005 to 2015 disaster CDBG-DR grant making, that the HUD has actually expedited that, have reduced the time from appropriation through allocation and delivery of first funds. So I think in many ways that was an anomaly, and one would assume that left to HUD's own purview that would continuously be standardized and shrunk, and certainly with permanent authorization that would allow even clearer transparency.
Yeah, it was a nefarious anomaly. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Menendez. Senator Tester is joining us from his office for 5 minutes from Montana. Senator Tester.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I appreciate the folks who are here to provide testimony today. I do come from Montana, and we have dealt with Mother Nature, the good, the bad, the ugly, and because of our connection to the great outdoors and our connection to agriculture and nature, is something that it's why many folks move to Montana because of this connection. But just this year, we faced incredible drought, and it could be said the same thing could be said for most of the ground west of the Mississippi. And of course, with drought also comes some pretty significant wildfire, which Montana was a part of also. Many of these are climate-triggered disasters. There are farmers who in recent years have struggled with excess moisture. I am one, and this year faced with drought. In fact, the worst drought we've had maybe since my grandparents homesteaded the land, but certainly in the 44 years that I've been on the farm. But that's another topic for another hearing, probably in a different committee. But when these disasters happen in our rural and frontier communities, they often don't get the attention and response of disasters like hurricanes hitting population centers. And because of that, these so-called smaller disasters in smaller communities are held hostage by the political process. They have to wait for a larger crisis to occur to be able to get the assistance that they need. So, Dr. Martin, could you talk about how these delays impact the federal government's ability to effectively respond to disasters?
Certainly, and the huge challenge, and some of the challenge, in particular for more rural communities and what we call medium or smaller scale disasters, which obviously have as much impact on those households as happens in larger scale disasters. For those, the impact for the individual household is just as severe, I should say. Is Congress appropriating for a year's worth of disasters, making a variety of disasters eligible with that still have unmet need at the point of the appropriation process. So there are ways to sort of be more generous and considerate of different communities. I would agree that it would be helpful for Congress to think a little bit more strategically about what the triggers are, and to ensure that there are a range of disasters that would be included, because it's the smaller scale disasters that don't get the large appropriations. But certainly a permanent authorization allows for a little more consistency in the appropriations process and allowing a certain amount of funds to be dispersed earlier on for communities that are going to be in need, regardless of their size and complexity.
Thank you. Mr. Sprayberry, what do these delays in assistance mean practically on the ground in these communities?
Well, what happens is, something that I think that a lot of people forget is most of the United States of America is still rural. And there's just not a lot of capacity or capability, even once you receive the disaster programs. And so I think as soon as you can get it and understand that you're getting it, and there is a degree of consistency and you know that you're going to be getting the funding, that's only going to help our smaller communities execute and implement those disaster programs. Because the way I used to say as a director, we need to be fast and we need to be aggressive. And I think that the federal government needs to do that all the way down through your municipalities. And so through the counties, the states, everybody. And so I think that the faster that we can be, the better it is, because if you slow it down, we're all here for one reason today. That's disaster survivors, real people. And so I think that that's what we all need to keep in mind and understand, that the faster that we can deploy the programs, the better it will be.
Appreciate that. I am the co-sponsor of a bill that we're actually considering today, the Reforming Disaster Recovery Act. Dr. Martin, I think it's fair to say our current system is inefficient. How would this legislation improve this process for the federal government?
Thank you, Senator Tester. Certainly the authorization and some of the other program requirements that are proposed in the legislation go a long way to making a sense of security and stability in the CDBG-DR process for state and local grantees, both in terms of the security of knowing the kind of appropriation that is coming, as well as the fact that some of the funding can occur earlier on and planning.
I appreciate that. I would just say that I know all our hearts go out to the folks in Kentucky and that whole region that got hit by that massive tornado, but it seems like everything is more massive these days. When I grew up and I've spent 65 years on the farm I'm on, I never ever remember having smoke for 2 or 3 months out of the year. And I live in eastern Montana, east of the Rocky Mountain front. But that happens almost every year now. And then we're seeing these horrendous hurricanes, incredibly damaging tornadoes. I think this is a really important hearing today, and I certainly appreciate the chairman and the ranking member for having it and all you for testifying. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Chester. Senator Smith from Minnesota is recognized from her office or home.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Chair Brown, and thanks to all of our panelists today. I'm really appreciating this. I'd like to start with Mr. Sprayberry. So in Minnesota, flooding disasters have received the most CDBG-DR funds. And with what we know is happening, which is climate change, which is increasing the frequency of these flooding disasters across the Midwest, how can programs like CDBG-DR and permanently reauthorizing them, how would that help communities to be able to prepare better, be more resilient to these ongoing disasters?
Thank you for that question, ma'am. And again, this legislation actually requires communities for their projects to make sure that they are being resilient as they build those projects. And so that's really critically important. I think that, again, HUD would create an Office of Disaster Management and Resiliency so that they can keep pushing out projects. We have the CDBG mitigation. Here in North Carolina, what we do is we loop up our CDBG-DR folks with our FEMA folks, and we have a resiliency office. And so we all work together to make sure that HUD allocations, FEMA money, and state appropriations, that we're as efficient as possible so that we take a look at different projects, and whoever is eligible for which project, then we can fit them in that slot so that nobody gets dropped between the cracks. And so I think that this legislation is going to really push the fact that we need to, when we have projects, and when we just don't put a house back in the floodplain.
Right.
We buy it out and move it out, or we elevate it. And so create more green space. And I think that that's what this will help us do. It'll be standardized, and I think it's going to also minimize risk and fraud.
Yeah, thank you for that. I totally agree. Dr. Martin, some are arguing that state and local government should pay for this kind of disaster recovery and mitigation efforts that CDBG-DR was designed to do. Now, I've worked at the state level and I've worked at the city level, and I've worked at both of those places when my state was dealing with significant disasters, and I just don't see the capacity there. The last time that Minnesota received these funds was in 2008, when city and state budgets were hit incredibly hard by massive flooding. And of course, at the same time, those budgets were being impacted by, would soon to be impacted by the Great Recession. And a lot of this was happening in rural communities where these smaller towns were really hard hit and not in a position. So can you address this issue? Is it really reasonable or realistic to say that local communities can sort of fill this gap if we weren't doing this?
Thank you for that question, Senator Smith. And I think those questions about local capacity are absolutely critical, particularly when we're talking about rural communities. Our studies, the qualitative components of our studies, have actually looked at local capacity issues, and clearly there are persistent issues with a level of emergency managers in rural counties and townships that just simply cannot either afford and don't have the resources to be able to do this. And by definition, we're talking about CDBGDR being required where there are unmet needs, continuing ongoing unmet needs. So there are tranches of other assistance programs, including those at the state and local level, that are filling that immediate need of relief and response already, and those are exhausted by the time CDBGDR comes in.
That's exactly right. It's not as if those local communities are just sitting on the sidelines. They've already done so much. Dr. Martin, I just want to quickly ask you one other question. You know, because I'm thinking about the interplay between the role of this CDBG-DR program and the broader challenges, systemic challenges that we have in our country around a shortage of housing, a shortage of particularly affordable housing, both rental and home ownership. And so, you know, what we know is happening in this country is working families are paying more and more of their housing. You've addressed this, more and more for their housing, or they are living farther and farther away from schools or their jobs where housing is more affordable, and then that puts additional costs on their family budgets. And you know, I want to point out that the President's Build Back Better bill, which we are going to pass, would make a significant difference in addressing this systemic housing shortage. But Dr. Martin, could you just quickly talk a little bit about how permanent reauthorization of this program would connect with the broader systemic problems we have in this country around housing shortage?
Certainly, and I'll be quick knowing the time constraints. That is exactly why CDBGDR plays a critical role in disaster recovery. It's because it's the Housing and Community Development Agency. So it's aware of the local housing constraints, the local housing markets. So in these cases where the housing market is already in crisis, natural hazard, or excuse me, in many cases, a non-natural hazard, breaks the back of these communities. So there isn't any availability. In many of these cases, after a hazard event, you'll see price gouging, rent gouging. You'll see and of course there are units that are off the market completely because they've been damaged and they're no longer there. So the ability, particularly to build affordable rental housing as quickly as possible, is probably the most immediate benefit of this proposed legislation. But it also just being able to prepare and plan for and incorporate longer-term community housing plans into a recovery framework is absolutely critical.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Senator Smith. Senator Cortez Masto from Nevada, from her office.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you to the panelists joining us today. I think we're all horrified by the tornadoes that we've seen that have devastated families and communities last week. I know with all my colleagues, express my deepest regrets to the families and friends of those died, lost their homes or businesses. But what we are also seeing, disasters are becoming more frequent and more devastating. When they occur, it is imperative that the federal government comes to the aid of people who have lost everything. So Dr. Martin and Mr. Sprayberry, let me ask you this. I introduced the Western Wildfire Support Act, which would allow communities in Nevada and across the West to access training, equipment, and funding they need to combat the increasing amount of land at risk of burnover. We are seeing wildfires that are no longer seasons, they're hotter, they're longer, and they have a devastating impact on our communities. But here's my question. Can you both talk about what a reauthorization of the Community Development Block Grant Disaster Recovery Program means for frontline communities in states like Nevada that need help to combat wildfires, frequently on land owned by the federal government? Remember, about 85% of the land in Nevada is owned by the federal government. And can you also address how important the program is to take into account critical habitat and ecosystems at risk of disaster as well? Because of the wildfires that we are seeing. Dr. Martin and Mr. Sprague, I'm going to ask you both if you could address that.
Certainly. Thank you, Senator. Certainly frontline communities are first and foremost in CDBGDR's planning and the eligible activities and beneficiaries that are allowed from the program. And so looking at those that are going to be suffering particular kinds of hazard events, that may or may not get the presidential declaration is part of the long-term community benefit, right? A community planning that CDBGR provides as a benefit to incorporate into the recovery framework. So I certainly appreciate that comment and that focus on that specific kind of frontline community. And I'll pass it to my colleague first before I respond to the second question.
Well, so we don't have a whole lot of wildfires here in North Carolina. We've had some, but I would say that, anything that, is going to help a frontline community, any program, we've all got to look at it, take a holistic view, and make sure that we're doing whatever we can, because even though, maybe you didn't have so many wildfires back in the 2000s, we know that now it's a normal course of action. You're going to have wildfires from year over year, just like hurricanes here in North Carolina. We saw the wind event in Iowa. So what are we going to do as a nation to take a look at the existing programs to help our frontline communities? So I think that it's something that we should look at and maybe understand what the hazard is, what the threat is, and how we can address it with the programs that are existing.
Thank you. And the other comment around sort of the land use planning, for example, the land that is controlled by federal government versus others. And that's, again, because it's in HUD, and HUD has a very specific role in managing and understanding local planning issues and housing development issues. HUD can certainly use its resources to ensure that people are trained about where not to build, not to further build, as well as what kind of protections can be made for communities that are already on at hazard's edge.
Thank you. And I've only got a few minutes left, but let me touch on the bill that Senator Tester talked about, Reforming Disaster Recovery Act of 2021. I know there were several recommendations for how to improve the funding that comes from the CDBG-DR. And can Dr. Martin or Mr. Spraber, can you speak to the data sharing provisions in the bill, and why is accurate data so important to have? And that clearly there's a concern that we're not accurate data we have and need right now.
Well, thank you for that question. And I can tell you that, we need to make sure before the bill is passed that those data sharing provisions have been well vetted. It's so critical that FEMA and HUD share that information so that, there isn't a duplication of benefits. And as we move forward, because duplication of benefits and how we actually check on those takes a lot of time and it costs a lot of money. And so the more data that can be shared between FEMA and HUD, the better it will be, and it will make for a more efficient operation. So that's one thing. I'm glad you asked that question, because we certainly need to make sure that that's in the legislation, and it is, but we just need to make sure that before it gets passed that it's well vetted and then good to go with both agencies.
When you ask a question about data, Senator, that is music to a researcher's ear. So I'm happy to say that there are probably two counts of data. One is the kind of data that my colleague panelist was mentioning, sort of the operational data. That would include everything from details about the beneficiaries that have been coming from other parts of the federal government. FEMA individual assistance, for example, is the first federal intervention in these communities' lives. And so understanding demographics about that community, understanding any requirements that have occurred operationally, including environmental review, to add on to the previous question that you had, that is required for every property. So there are so many pieces of data that have occurred operationally that is helpful for HUD to receive and to operationalize. But in the legislation, the data that is being referred to is more granular demographic data about the beneficiaries. And certainly that is would be helpful for HUD to have, as well as the federal government to have, because of its other statutory requirements, the constitutional requirements on civil rights, et cetera. So making sure that HUD is able to collect that data and do analysis, and in some cases share it at an aggregate level to the public to confirm that the right people are being served.
Thank you again.
Thank you, Senator Cortez Masto. Thanks to the witnesses for joining us today. Everyone, thank you, everybody, for following, every day, following disaster is one day too many, and what has happened in this country. So we have a lot of work to do. I ask unanimous consent to enter into the record a letter from the Bipartisan Policy Center sent to Senator Toomey and to me without objection, so ordered. For senators who wish to submit questions, for the record, those questions are due 1 week from today, Wednesday, December 22nd. To our witnesses, thank you, Mr. Sprayberry, Mr. Mayor, and Dr. Martine. To the witnesses, per our committee rules, we ask that you respond to any questions from members of this committee within 45 days of your receipt of them. Thank you again. The committee is adjourned.